Hey everybody, I'm Ryan, this is The Will to Make, and today I'm going to show you how I built this table that also folds up to the wall.
So a friend of ours was needing a table for her photography studio and wanted it to be able to be folded up to the wall but also be freestanding if need be. So I started by laying down some foam to start breaking down my plywood. First marked out for the top of the table. And with my circular saw lowered just below the plywood, I cut the top out. Next, I cut 3 strips, 2 at 3.5 inches and 1 at 2 inches. These will later be cut down to become the legs and stretchers. I then cut 3 pieces of 2x4s for my aprons. I only need the 3 because I need to leave one side open so my legs can fold down. Using a pocket hole jig, I drilled for pocket screws. I marked out where my aprons will sit underneath the table. Using lots of glue, I attached the aprons to the bottom. Where the aprons all met, I secured them to each other just to add a little more rigidity. Next were the front legs. Out of the strip of 3.5 inch plywood, I cut 2 legs and the bottom stretcher, and the top stretcher was cut from the 2-inch strip. I set the 2 legs in place and marked where I wanted the top stretcher to be. Using pocket hole screws and glue, I attached the top stretcher to the legs. After putting the one side on, I realized that it would be easier to do the other side on the ground. For the bottom stretcher, I needed a notch cut out to accept the stretcher that will run between the front and back legs. This is what will allow the table to be freestanding. The notch is cut using a jigsaw, making sure to stay within my lines so I can sand later on to get a good fit. Once the notch was cut, the stretcher could then be attached to the bottom of the legs, again using glue and pocket hole screws. I laid this scrap piece of plywood down to inset the stretcher a little. Once the leg assembly was complete, I set it in place and clamped it down. I laid out where I wanted to drill for my bolts. This is where the legs will pivot on the table. I slowly drilled, making sure to stay as straight as I could in all directions. Next to the bolt, I drilled a smaller hole, and this is where my pin will be set to lock the legs in place. If the pin is a little tight, drill some more and wiggle the bit around. Moving on, I cut 3 pieces of 2x4 for the back leg assembly that will attach to the wall and where the table will pivot up. These were also assembled with glue and pocket hole screws. This is when I realized that I forgot to cut a strip for the bottom stretcher on the back leg assembly. I marked it out, and using my circular saw, I cut it out. A notch was then cut in this as well, again for the stretcher that will allow the table to be freestanding. I wanted this stretcher to be flush with the back of the legs, but also wanted my pocket holes to be on the back of the legs. So I glued the stretcher in, clamped it down, flipped the whole thing over, and then installed my pocket hole screws. Next, I needed to cut my piano hinge to length. I laid it on the leg assembly and made my mark. It was then cut with a hacksaw. It was a little difficult to get it started, but once it was, it cut pretty easy. I temporarily attached the hinge to the table and the legs. This was to figure out where my notches on my center stretcher needed to be in order to have the table be freestanding. Once I got those measurements, I could then lay out where the notches needed to be and cut them out. While the table was still temporarily assembled, I cut 2 squares out of the 3.5-inch strip to act as hard stops for the front leg assembly. I cut a 45-degree angle on them just to make them look a little nicer. They were then glued and nailed on the front of the legs. At this point, the top of my front legs were still square, so they were not able to rotate, so I rounded them off. My jigsaw couldn't quite get the whole thing, so I had to clean it up with a reciprocating saw. Once cut, I folded the legs down and drilled within the same hole for the pin. This will now lock the legs in the folded position for when the table is stowed on the wall. At this point, my hinge bolts were still way too long, so I marked where they needed to be cut. Since I don't have a vise yet, I used a clamp and held the bolt while I cut using a hacksaw. They sell little plugs to fill in pocket holes, but I had this wood filler and decided just to use that, and it ended up working just great. Once the wood filler had cured, I went over everything with some 120 grit sandpaper. Once sanded, I gave everything 2 coats of white paint, using a brush to get in all the corners and a roller for everything else. Next was the install. I used a stud finder to locate the studs. We didn't want to cut any of the trim away from the wall, so we decided to just install it right on top of it. I positioned the back legs and attached it to the wall using some 4-inch lag screws. I was going to use more screws, but with the location of the table, we only did 2, which was still plenty sturdy. I even got up on the table later on myself, and it held up just great. I positioned the tabletop and screwed to the back assembly. I made sure to put a screw in every hole along the hinge. After installing a latch to hold the tabletop, it was complete. To use, simply unlatch, pull the pins out of the legs, and pull down on the table. Once down, simply insert the pins to lock the legs. And here it is with the bottom stretcher in between both leg assemblies to allow the table to be freestanding if need be. Overall, I love how the table turned out, and it will add so much functionality to our studio and be able to fold out of the way if need be. I will have links to all the tools I use in this video in the description below, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.